on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
It's 7:06. It's O'Connor and Company here on this second day of January. Happy New Year, everyone, as 2024 rolls out right in front of us like a red carpet. It's just up to us to parade down it and wave at the paparazzi. Coming up at 7:35, Bethany Mandel will join us. I have no idea what that metaphor meant. It felt right. Bethany Mandel joins us at 7:35. 8:05, Denise Rucker-Krepp. She used to be on the D.C. Advisory Neighborhood Commission. She wants to talk about how Democrats, her fellow Democrats, are creating the crime problem in D.C. That's all coming up. I'm Larry O'Connor alongside Julie Gunlock. Julie, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I know yesterday you and Andrew Langer discussed Governor Mike DeWine's inexplicable decision in Ohio to veto that bill that would have protected children from genital mutilation procedures. That and a whole host of other stories we need to hit from a legal and judicial perspective with Sarah Perry. She's the senior legal fellow in the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies over at Heritage Foundation. Sarah Perry, Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us. Sarah? Oh, did we lose her? All right, we'll try to connect again with her. In the meantime, if you could you play what DeWine said on Friday real fast so we can comment on it?
These are gut-wrenching decisions. These are gut-wrenching decisions that should be made by parents and should be informed by teams of doctors who are advising them.
This is weird, and I know you used to work, full disclosure, you worked in his Senate staff, right?
I worked for him, yes, for several years. It's where I met my husband. And I'm so disappointed and I'm so disgusted by this decision that he made. Does Mike DeWine think that parents should be allowed to abuse their children, to cut off their ears? Maybe they don't like their ears. Yeah. Does DeWine think that parents should be allowed to starve their children? Maybe put them in closets and lock them in closets. I mean, the state has a role in protecting children against abusive parents, and if you
abusive doctors,
doctors, yes.
Abusive and exploitive medical system, and he's echoing the argument that was made to support Roe v. Wade for decades when he ran as a pro-life guy. Sarah Perry is with us now from Heritage. Will you tell me, Sarah Perry? It seems to me that the state does have a role in determining whether these procedures are barbaric and horrific and disgusting. This isn't simply just let's parents decide this sort of thing with their doctor, is it?
No, it's not. And this is actually really encouraging because I think more and more people are seeing this. There have been 21 vetoes, 21 pieces of legislation passed like this all across the country that are restricting these particular procedures for minors because they're taking this from the model of sort of a child welfare or child abuse standpoint. Remember, that's why we have organizations like Child Protective Services, so that when there is a belief that a parent is not acting in a child's best interest, that they are in fact abusing them or neglecting them, that the state can step in. It's under a theory called in loco parentis, or parents patriae, where the state says, listen, we have an interest not only in letting you parent your own children the way you see fit, but in also positions where we know that harm is being done, stepping in and actually interfering to make sure that that child is protected.
I found that in his statement, he sounded like he was parroting these talking points about, this has to be a parent's decision along with a team of doctors. What is so frustrating about that is the medical community is terrible on this issue. And there is video of doctors being trained to manipulate parents into these decisions. We know the American Pediatric Association and many of these other medical associations have been, horrible on this issue. And so that frustrates me too, is DeWine's unwillingness to recognize that the medical field is willing to manipulate parents into making these bad decisions for their kids.
Yeah, and the problem there is that so much of the medical community has been completely politicized. And we're also not being told about the dissent from alternative organizations like the American College of Pediatricians, right? So we know the American Endocrine Society and the American Academy of Pediatrics have all pushed what they're telling everyone is settled science. But we know for a fact it's not settled science. It's experimentation, and it's developing as it's going along. Unfortunately, much of this is fueled by a top-down approach from the federal government. Remember, the first executive order when the president stepped into office in January of 2021 was to sign an executive order expanding the definition of sex to include gender identity. And the problem with that is that it affected every federal law and every federal regulation that would have naturally separated sex biologically or protected the biological distinctions between sex, and ultimately shook up the entire panoply of civil rights regulations and laws. That has had a trickle-down effect. So, of course, when you tell Americans and you direct the administrative executive agencies to act in a certain way, it sort of fuels the fire of making us all believe that the science is not only settled, but this is in the best interest of national governance, when in fact it is not.
We're speaking with Sarah Perry of Heritage Foundation. Let me throw a couple of legal aspects of this to you and maybe figure out through our crystal ball how this might end up being resolved. Because now we've got a situation in Ohio where the governor has said, listen, this should be between a parent and their doctors and their child. Where on the other side of the coin in California, you've got a governor who's saying, if the parents say no, if the parents decide, no, we're not going to walk down this gender-affirming care path, then the government can take the child away from the parent. Yep. So you've got two different states with two very different approaches. And, of course, you've got a third idea in Florida where the governor has said, no, this is illegal for anyone, any minor. Once you reach the age of 18, you can do whatever you want to your body, I guess. So how does this get resolved? Is this ultimately a Supreme Court decision?
Yes, absolutely. And, in fact, there's a case right now on the exact same concept, treating these refusals to achieve gender-affirming care for a minor child as child abuse. I think the Supreme Court is ultimately going to have to weigh in. And it really goes to that question of sort of what the parameters are of the 14th Amendment's long recognized constitutional right to parent one's children as one sees fit. Remember, Meyer versus Nebraska, 2023. We're now over 100 years old. The Supreme Court has said that's one of those fundamental liberty interests that, while it's not specifically in the Constitution, we recognize as being fundamental to our understanding of personal liberty. But never in any context has the Supreme Court or any other federal court determined that the right to achieve specific care for a minor child was part of that 14th Amendment right. And in fact, in some instances, federal courts have stepped in and said, wait a minute, this is a question that you have to leave to experts. It is not the parent's right to say, we want X treatment, because the parents, while they love their kids, are not actually doctors. But it is also a very worrying trend that we're now seeing it partnered with child abuse laws.
And I wonder if
welfare laws.
I wonder if that's the best legal test, because you've got some people will say it's child abuse to do gender affirming care. There's or so-called gender affirming care, I should say. There's others who will say it's child abuse to not allow this care. And let me just, again, this is important. I know that being a devil's advocate can be frustrating sometimes, but I think when you're talking about legal issues like this, it's valid. You know, there's some who will say that circumcision is genital mutilation, that circumcision should be outlawed, and you know what is stopping the interpretation of prohibitions against this sort of thing to then translate to that sort of decision that a parent can make for their child?
Yeah, so there are two aspects to that. First is that this is a very settled procedure that has been in place really for millennia, right?
Literally, yes. Going back to Abraham.
Practice, right. Yes. That's been practiced for millennia without any complications or limited complications, that it is accepted both by sort of politicized and non-politicized, right and left-leaning medical organizations and pediatric communities, number one. And number two, it's very often affiliated with Orthodox religious practice, which is not something that the Supreme Court is ever going to get involved in and say this part of your religious practice cannot be actually exercised. So that's really the one side of the coin.
Yeah.
But I think what we're seeing in terms of this very rapid weaponization of these state welfare laws, if they're thinking, listen, we can't get it through the Constitution because maybe the Supreme Court or a federal court won't buy the argument that this is actually a violation of a 14th Amendment right. If we use the child welfare statutes in our own state law, the question there is not only going to be what is the definition of child abuse, number one, but number two, what exactly is the state's power to step in and do something for it? Those are two very big questions that I do think ultimately the high court's going to have to wrestle with.
Sarah Perry from Heritage Foundation, this is one of those perfect storm issues where both Julie and I know our listeners care deeply about it. It's intricate because it's scientific as well as legal, and we still have more to ask you. So can you stick with us for one more segment, because we both have a lot more questions, and I know our listeners want to hear more.
I sure can.
Oh, good. All right, then.
WMAL, making sense of the border, because laws either matter or they don't. Download the WMAL app to stream us for free.
We're continuing with Sarah Perry here. She's with the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at Heritage Foundation, and the question is how the courts might come down on this question of children getting so-called gender-affirming care, and whether it is child abuse to allow it or child abuse to disallow it, as various states have weighed in on it. This, of course, after Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, vetoed a measure that would have prohibited this for children. So what is the legal precedent here, Ms. Perry, if I could ask, with regard to the state deciding what is in the best interests of children and what can or cannot be taken out of a parent's decision-making power?
Well, that's where you've got sort of the power of the state under state law butting up against that recognized constitutional right. And because the Supreme Court is loath to stay out of definitions of state law, it will generally do so. It will leave those questions to, for example, the state Supreme Courts. And it will ultimately say, listen, you all wrote the definition. You should know better what the definition is. We don't want to interfere. But when you've got that federal interest that's been recognized in the Constitution because of the understanding of the legal supremacy, right, under the Supremacy Clause, we've got federal law, we've got state law. The Supreme Court is ultimately very likely to say, we've never recognized that 14th Amendment right includes a right to mutilate your child. And while you have an interest in regulating a certain way and defining a certain way, we find the interest of these minors to be preeminent, and that's when they're going to step in.
Okay, so this bill that DeWine vetoed also would have protected and preserved women's sports. So now I even hate to use the word transgender child because there is no such thing, but transgender identifying children. So a male child, a male minor who identifies as a woman can now play in women's sports. What will it take? Will that also take a lawsuit? Will the courts have to rule on that as well in order to have this outlaw? What is the remedy for parents who are concerned about their young daughters playing with biological males?
Yes. And, that was sort of the double injury of House Bill 68 being vetoed, right? It wasn't just the banning of these gender-affirming procedures for minors, but also the permission, the allowance of biological males to compete against biological females in K through 12 sports. That, for me, as a mother of 3 teenage kids, was also particularly injurious, I think, to my notion of whether or not Mike DeWine was exhibiting good sense. The ultimate question here, and believe it or not, there is yet another cert petition pending right now at the Supreme Court on the exact same issue. So the Supreme Court is going to have to wrestle, I think, with notions of what sex means in law from one aspect or another. And we've got 2 very good decisions, both out of the 6th Circuit and the 11th Circuit, that have said sex is biologically distinct, right? We can look back to 1972 and Title IX, which indicated that there were equal opportunities to be established for men and women. We're not going to upend the entire panoply of civil rights law and say, you know what, now suddenly we've decided it doesn't matter, particularly when athletic skill and physical fitness and physical aptitude are involved. And in fact, we'll just allow anyone to compete on any team that they want. That, to me, I think is a more ripe question. We still have some of these issues related to gender-affirming health care that are sort of percolating up and have to hit the federal circuit before they hit the Supreme Court circuit. I think it might be a premature petition for cert on that particular case. But the one that is much closer to resolution, I believe, is this question about distinctions in sports, because it goes to interpretation of Title IX. Ultimately, that's what these state bills are modeled on. Yeah. And as we know, the administration is getting ready to drop a rule, they've said in March or April, that is expanding the definition of sex to include gender identity and allowing this kind of sports participation. That's a big question, and it's also going to be, I think, have to resolve at the Supreme Court, because now you've got the power of a federal agency to make their own definitions up.
And quickly, and we really only have 30 seconds, but it seems to me then if the Supreme Court is going to make a decision based on sports, they need to default to, all right, we need some sort of objective truth and reality here. And when it comes to sex or gender, the only objective truth and reality is biological, right? Otherwise, you can just change this on an ongoing basis at any given time. And if they make that decision, then will that have a domino effect onto all of these other with regard to medical procedures? Like, nope, the Supreme Court's decided this is what sex means. It's this biological reality, and therefore all of these other things, these laws allowing or disallowing the procedure, they then have to go into the ash bin.
That's exactly it. And I think this is sort of the fallout from 2020 Supreme Court decision, Bostock versus Clayton County. Remember, that was the employment discrimination case. But even in that case, where the determination was made that sex discrimination in employment also included discrimination on the basis of gender identity, even there, Gorsuch began his opinion by saying sex is biological.
Right.
The Supreme Court is going to have to reiterate that and have to clarify for everyone some lines cannot be crossed, some truths are not fungible.
Super smart stuff. Sarah Perry, Heritage Foundation. We expect no less from that august organization. Thank you for joining us, as always. It is
Thanks for having me.
7:24. Coming up in our 7:30 hour, we're going to check in with Bethany Mandel, who has been obviously just 100% focused on the events of October 7th and the aftermath. We'll get her to comment on David Schwimmer and other Hollywood celebrities actually coming out and recognizing who the Nazis are amongst us, and the protests in our city streets, and the lack of action from the Democratic Party here on something that should be pretty cohesive and uniting: our support for Israel and our opposition to murder and rape. But, you know, Democrats. It's 7:30.
WMAL-FM, Woodbridge, Washington, a Cumulus media station.
Making sense of the news.
News Talk 105.9.
News now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
7:36 here on this Tuesday morning, but not just any Tuesday morning. First work day of 2024. Happy New Year, one and all. Coming up at 8:05, Denise Rucker-Krepp. She's a former D.C. Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. She's going to discuss the Sentencing Commission, how they've allowed convicted criminals, murderers, to continue to roam the streets of D.C. You wonder why there's a crime problem, a violent crime problem in Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor alongside Julie Gunlock. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning.
And joining us now is a dear friend of our program and friend of ours personally, Bethany Mandel. She's co-author of the best-selling book Stolen Youth. And Bethany, your efforts to raise awareness on the ongoing terror attacks of October 7th. Everyone says, oh, it was the terror attack of October 7th. There are innocent women and children who are continue to be held in terrifying captivity by the hostages, by the terrorists, by Hamas. This is an ongoing event that is materializing before our eyes, the sexual assault, the abuse, the terror. And people are equivocating over, borders and boundaries and the UN and who has the historic right. And the fact that Hamas sympathizers in this country have seen the events of October 7th as an impetus to make a case for their political rights to this territory. I honestly, maybe I'm naive, but I never thought I would live to see this in our country, in this planet, frankly. And I am disheartened every day. But I appreciate you for raising awareness and drawing focus back to what's really at issue here. Thank you for joining us. That was a very long introduction. Just say whatever you want.
I loved every minute of it. Keep on talking about how great I am, Larry. What a wonderful Tuesday morning wake up.
Right. Well, I just... The protests continue, and we're seeing, ongoing violence here in the streets of America by these pro-Hamas terrorists. And frankly, the most disheartening thing is the media and members of a certain political party in this country who refuse to be able to draw the line on even this. They equivocate for their own political purposes.
Yeah, it's terrifying because, we keep on being told, there's context here. There's context for what happened on October 7th, that, there was precipitating events that led up to it. And all of these people spent the last how many years talking about believe all women, and there's no excuse for anything. Like, you can't even look at a woman for a beat too long. And then fast forward to October 7th, and, there's context for the brutal assault and murder of women and children in their beds. And suddenly, it's not believe all women. Now it's let's take a 2.5-month beat and investigate all of the claims, all of the forensics, all of the photos, all of the video that Hamas themselves took. And then after the New York Times publishes an expose on their front page, if you read the comments of that New York Times piece, they are so disturbing. There is no amount of evidence that will convince people who honestly think that the Jews had it coming. No matter what happened to them, the Jews had it coming.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit more about that New York Times piece. It took them 3 months. And you can tell that, they go into the forensic evidence. They talk about this. And, I was reading the New York Times article. It's very hard to read. But the whole time I'm thinking, my God, why did this take you so long? And you can tell that they were extra careful with it, which, there's just this sense of, it's almost like they knew no one will believe us. Why did it take the New York Times, and why has it taken the media in general, Bethany? I mean, I know the answer to this, but tell us why it's taking them so long to cover this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth with the New York Times piece 2.5 months later. They did do a really incredible job. And I think that there are different individuals in the building who have different priorities. And so, when there was an explosion at a hospital in Gaza, they were very quick to assign blame, and then they had to roll it back. They're being much more careful, but always, and I say this as an opinion writer who has written for publications left to right, I am subjected to an absurd amount of fact-checking and questions and revisions when I write for liberal papers. And then I read, like, the New York Times literally published a member of Hamas. And I don't think that individual had questions from the editors. Like, do you want to mention, like, the fact that you're holding hostages? Do you want to mention, like, the beheaded baby? Like, there was no requests for revision on that front before they were allowed to publish in the New York Times. And yet the standard that another side is held to by these publications is absurd. And it's a form of censorship. It's a form of viewpoint censorship that they very happily engage in.
I want to reveal something, and hopefully you're okay with me revealing this, but I think it's public knowledge.
I'm not pregnant, right?
Yes, I have
Just kidding.
breaking
Go
news.
ahead.
No. We're in the news business, not in the routine here, Bethany. You and your husband, Seth, your family, the Mandel family, you named your dog Truman.
Yeah.
And I believe that is in honor of Harry Truman, the President of the United States, a Democrat who was the first world leader to recognize the legitimacy of the State of Israel after the UN defined the borders and well, I shouldn't say define the borders, but recognize the borders. because there was a time when this was not a Democrat or Republican issue, Bethany. I recognize that we have divided government and we have a divided nation, but I truly do wish things like this weren't partisan, that they weren't political. How did we get here? That even after October 7th, we've got a president, Joe Biden, who used to be pretty good on this issue, who is now talking out of both sides of his mouth. He says the right things one day, but then his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor are admonishing Benjamin Netanyahu for defending his people. It's been said, Politico has reported that inside the White House there is concern that if they come out too strong in favor of Israel, the victim of this terror attack, that they could lose votes. How did we get here, Bethany?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say I defend a lot of what Biden has done. I think that Biden has been uncharacteristically clear-headed, and so have some members of his administration. But this, I think, isn't as much of a political issue as it is a generational issue. And it's because of our education system being in the toilet and brainwashing that's happening on social media, namely TikTok. Yeah. And all of these generational gaps skew left. When you're young, you're a Democrat, and then when you grow up, you realize you're robbed by reality. You veer more to the right. And so there is an education problem that we have in this country that is terrifying, and I don't know how to de-radicalize an entire generation, but we have to. And we don't have a president and we don't have leadership in this country. And I actually honestly say that on both sides, who recognize that we have a de-radicalization problem on our hands.
Well, and it goes back to your book that you wrote with the great Carol Markowitz, Stolen Youth, because our children are being mentally and emotionally and socially abused by the system that we have put them in and the system that we've created.
From
and
us.
we've got to harness it and get it back. And we are, slowly but surely. You are one child at a time over there in the Mandel household. What do you got a baseball
too,
team
man.
now.
You're carrying it up. Between the three of us, we have 12
we're up
children?
we're close to 15 here between the three of us.
Oh my God.
Heather Hunter's got to step up. She's only got 2. Come on, Heather, let's go. Do you want me to call Derek? I'll handle it. I'll get it. I'll take care of it. Thank you, Bethany. We love you. Happy New Year to you. This is going to be a better year, I promise. Things are going to be, it can't get any worse, right?
Amen.
Yeah.
God bless you.
Yeah, I mean.
All right. Did I just cut you off in the middle of something?
No. I was just going to be really dark and dire and say, well, never say never. But then I was like, I'm going to be more cheerful.
Thank you. It's a morning show, for God's sake.
I know.
Save that for Levin.
I'm trying to be cheerful.
All right. 7:45 WMAL. Well, D.C. has started 2024 with a bang, if I may say, because we've got murders already recorded. Within an hour of New Year's Day, we had our first murder right here in our neighborhood, actually, of WMAL, Friendship Heights area. And the crime continues. We had a brazen carjacking right in front of Union Station as a person in a Toyota Corolla was unloading and loading passengers and luggage, and the car was taken in a what they're calling a hop-in carjacking.
Toyota Corolla.
Well, it's free car is a free car, man.
By the way, Andrew, who subbed for you on Monday, was staying at the hotel where the woman was shot.
When the murder well, I mean, do we know where he was at the time of the murder?
You're terrible. They are looking for a suspect.
This has got Agatha Christie written all over it.
No, it doesn't.
Talk radio murders.
You're gonna get off the air and start writing your book, aren't you?
It's part of my New Year's resolution. But DC has a solution here. They have a solution to the crime problem. Joel Caston. Now you'll remember him. He was elected as a Ward 7 neighborhood council commissioner while he was incarcerated at a DC jail. He's now been released on parole after serving 26 years in prison as a convicted murderer, and he's now becoming a member of the he's being nominated right now to be on the DC Sentencing Commission. A convicted murderer who served over a quarter century in prison is now being put on the Sentencing Commission for the District of Columbia. You know who's not on the Sentencing Commission? Victims.
Yes.
Or family members of victims. They don't have a voice, but a murderer has a voice.
Just amazing.
Coming up later in the program at 8:05, in fact, we're going to check in with Denise Rucker-Krebs. She's a Democrat. She lives in D.C. She is a former neighborhood commissioner. I want to get her take on this because she's been ahead of the curve on where things are going in D.C. right now. And there are no solutions coming from elected officials. Let's not forget it was less than a year ago that Phil Mendelson, under oath before the House Oversight Committee, said there's no crime problem in D.C.
I think, and he's the one who proposed this guy, this
That's
convicted
correct.
murderer.
That is correct. And I want to reiterate my position that home rule is a failed experiment.
Yes.
And there's nothing stopping Congress with a single vote to bring back their control, their constitutional authority over the District of Columbia, because this needs to be a safe, orderly city where citizens from all around the country, let alone people from all around the world, should be able to visit and have business with the federal government without fearing for their lives. That's a basic.
And just very quickly, very quickly, the people in Virginia and Maryland who think this doesn't affect you, it does. It spreads into the suburbs.
Yeah, you're right, because many people will listen and say, well, that's D.C.'s problem. You get what you vote for. No, it affects all around. Let's just look at what's going on in Fairfax and Alexandria. Yeah. It's 7:50.